Hello everyone. مرحبا جميعا. إن شاء الله تكونوا كلكم منيح. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue et vous remercie de vous être rejoints à nous ce soir, aujourd'hui. My name is Lana Zaiter and I am a PhD candidate in Educational Studies at McGill University. We are very happy to welcome you all and welcome our speaker, Professor Joseph Bianco from Melbourne University. First of all, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. We join you today from McGill University, which is situated in Jajage, Montreal, the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka people as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which we join you today. We also invite each of you to reflect on and acknowledge the Indigenous lands in your own context. Now I would like to pass it on to Dr. Angelica Galante, the director of the Plurilingual Lab, to say a few words about our speaker. Dr. Galante, I'll pass it on to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lana. Well, welcome everybody. We are very happy today to welcome Professor Joseph Bianco, or simply Joe, as he likes to be called. Professor Bianco is a professor of language and literacies education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and he serves as immediate past president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He was the first educator elected to this role, actually. In 2012, he was appointed research director of the UNICEF Language and Peacebuilding Initiative in Malaysia, Myanmar, and Thailand. Since 2011, he has served as senior research advisor for LUCID, a European Commission project on languages in urban communities, integration and diversity for Europe, conducting large-scale 4-year research on multilingualism at the municipal level in 12 European cities. In January 2014, he began an academic advisory role with the National Research Center for Foreign Language Education at Beijing Foreign Studies University, providing advice to the State Language Commission and supporting academic research initiatives. Professor Bianco wrote Australia's National Policy on Languages in 1987, the first multilingual national language policy in an English-speaking country, and he was chief executive of the National Languages and Literacy Institute of Australia until 2002. The National Policy on Languages was adopted by the Australian government as a comprehensive national plan to cover all of Australia's language needs and interests: English and English literacy, English as a second language and a foreign language, and languages other than English, including Indigenous language rights, immigrant and foreign languages, as well as language services such as research, translating, and interpreting public media. Professor Bianco has advised on language, culture, and literacy education and on the integration of Indigenous and immigrant children into mainstream schools, reconciliation, and peace through education in many countries, including Council of Europe, Sri Lanka, Ireland, Wales, and the UK, Italy, Slovenia, Canada, Vietnam, Singapore, South Africa, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, among other countries. His language policy advising activity includes language services for the Sydney Olympic Games, a report which was subsequently used to support multilingualism at the Athens and London Games, assistance to the Government of Ireland to produce a 20-year strategy to support the vitality of Irish, support on basic education, literacy, and language policy in South Africa, Hawaii, Italy, Alberta in Canada, Western Samoa, and other Pacific Islands countries, preparation of a national language education plan for the government of Sri Lanka in 1999 under the World Bank financing, commissioned support for language policy in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, Department of Education and Language Policy and Multiculturalism as part of the Good Friday Peace Agreement in 2000-2003, consultancy to the Israel Ministry of Education, and many other international collaborative activities. Wow, without much further ado, I welcome you all to Professor Joseph Bianco. And I'm going to pass it on to Lana just so she gives some etiquette in the Zoom room. Thank you, Lana.
Thank you, Dr. Galante. So just a few things that we would like you to keep in mind during the presentation. So during the talk, please keep your video and sound off. However, you can react by using the reaction feature of Zoom. So either use the thumbs up and hands clapping feature. Keep in mind that the talk will be recorded and available on the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel. So make sure to follow us on social media for when the announcement is made. After the talk, there will be a discussion period. It will be around 30 minutes. You can post your questions in the chat, or you can simply unmute your microphone and ask the question. The discussion will be moderated by our very own Miguel Sanchez Luna, and it will not be recorded. So without further ado, Professor Joe Bianco, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much indeed.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. I too want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge that this has been a place of learning for thousands of years. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and congratulations to everybody involved in putting up this very, very impressive series of talks and participation. It's a great credit to you. So I'm going to present now. I need to share my screen. I'll take one moment to do that. And if someone could confirm that that's visible. And
We can
yes,
see you.
good. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, so the topic here that I've been assigned, or I assigned myself, is to combine two things: language rights, the question of language rights, understood in different ways, and peace building, which is not normally associated, except perhaps rhetorically, with multilingualism and language rights, but that's going to be the bulk of what I talk about. And I'm going to use these two as springboards for the development of a discussion about new directions in how we think about multilingualism and language policy. And the context within which all this is happening is important to note, which is that we are well into the decade, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and this should be something that we are all aware of. It's part of a global effort. To the extent that we have anything like coordinated global action, it rests with organizations like UNESCO and the United Nations in general. And their General Assembly, as you can see, adopted this resolution on the rights of Indigenous peoples. They made 2019 the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and then followed that up with the declaration of a decade. Now, 1 year and even a decade, frankly, won't be enough to reverse the atrocious deterioration in the language diversity and vitality of the world. We have all to take some responsibility for acting in this area. So I like to start off with that, because that is really in the background, but it should be something that we don't lose sight of, even if it's not directly our area of work. The focus of my talk, as I said, is this combination of applied linguistics, and in particular how I approach applied linguistics, which is around PB, or peace building. And I'm going to devote a bit of discussion to that soon. And language policy and planning, which is the other area of my work. I started off life as a professional economist. I wasn't particularly happy with that choice. It just fell to me for various reasons. My parents were immigrants to Australia, and I grew up. My initial language is not English, and I was very aware of language problems and issues that faced new immigrants, and in a rural agricultural area of isolation as well. So I was always quite conscious of these things, but never it was never the focus of my work until I had done a degree. And then I volunteered working with new immigrants, mostly Timorese women escaping the colonization of their country. And I was teaching English, for which I was not trained, and I became aware of the incredible importance of questions of language in relation to the prospects for a regular and normal life for such people. Anyway, so I returned to university and became a sociolinguist or language planner, if you will, and language educator. So I've been very interested in languages from that point of view for all of my life. In recent years, I've worked in settings where conflicts involve language questions, and I've been startled in reading the literature. Until very recently, there was very little focus on conflict and tension in multilingual discourse. And I think that a large part of this was because of a desire among linguists to project a message that languages were a way of promoting harmony. And I do believe that languages and language rights in particular are part of a process of promoting social justice and good civil relations. But I don't think we get there by avoiding the fact that they are sometimes implicated in conflict. So I'm concerned with settings where it's very clear that language is part of conflict and even communal violence. Now, it's not the languages themselves that are producing this. Of course, it's how languages are used by political forces, usually oppressively against minority populations. And the focus of the work has been South and Southeast Asia, Australia, and Oceania. I worked in the Pacific Islands and many places. After I did the national policy in Australia in the late 1980s, I had been involved in policy work in my own state for many years before then. It became known, and I received many invitations to work in other countries with people saying, well, can you give us a hand to help build a language policy that is more inclusive of minority interests? And so that's really what's become my career, and it was on the basis of those invitations that I developed concern for the literature, which I felt was not focused enough on how language knowledge, linguistics, language education knowledge is positioned in policy settings. And so that actually brought me back to my economic training, and I was able to fuse the two because economics is really the language of government. So I'm going to describe a political problem and a language problem. A lot of people don't like to speak of the concept of language problems. I'll defend that in a few moments. And through both a practice and a theoretical lens. And I'm going to describe the methodology that I've devised for doing this, which I call multi-log facilitated deliberation. I'll describe that later. And the purpose of this, and even of this talk, is to build a shared understanding of how language problems are real in society and how what is a language problem is defined by powerful interests, usually against multilingualism and minority populations, and how we can proceed to do this work, giving voice to marginalized and racialized populations and their demands for recognition. And I want to build and enshrine a quest for multilingual literacy, for a practical approach to language rights, and for a culture of collective problem definition. That's a lot to do. I've given you 3 readings. I hope people have had a chance to look at those, and I'm happy to interact with people if they want to know more. And of course, if people want to ask questions or contest things I've said, etc. There are general background premises other than the International Year that I want to mention. And one of these is, and it concerns mostly, I guess, the societies that I think are mostly present in this series of speeches, but I could be wrong on that, Canada and Australia particularly, I imagine. And that is that I think in our societies, I think this is widely true as well. Just a couple of days ago, I had a wonderful interaction with law masters and PhD students from a university in South Africa, and many of the students there were from other African countries, and it was extraordinary how how much agreement we had on these very points, that there is a palpably declining trust between officials and experts, and policy discussions are visibly and increasingly corrupted by accusations of interest and ideology. I think there's a lot in that statement, but that's all I can say right now. This comes at a time, and I'm going to talk about this substantially a bit later, when the idea of policy, the aspiration for policy was that it would be a science, a series of techniques that would be above criticism. And even the early language planners of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, some of them anyway, many of them perhaps, had a belief that data-driven decisions, some of them, even Joshua Fishman described it once as actuarial data, would improve contested political situations because the science would stand above interests. And that in policy training schools and in the general thinking about government, it was believed that the role of academics was to speak truth to power. So we had this idea of ourselves in this position of truthfulness, speaking to power, which was seen to be a relatively less truthful, maybe even corrupted space. And yet, this division between officials and experts in the community and etc. is extremely troubling in general for our democracy. But I think it's particularly troubling today because we live in a communication world, as I've already said, with the immense pressure against small communities, minority communities, communities that don't have the support of a state or that have active opposition and hostility from it. And language policy writing tends to proceed in the traditional way that all general policy does, is through statistical work, through the claims to objectivity that it uses, etc. So I think this is a concern, and I think it's a particular concern for language rights, because the question of language rights has got ultimately to be a moral issue. Even though it's progressed really quite rapidly in scholarly research, and there's a recent handbook on linguistic human rights, which is an impressive achievement. The creation of new bodies, the Global Coalition for Language Rights, the Linguistic Justice Foundation, and the remarkable multilingual education network based in Bangkok that I'm going to mention later, and with which I've collaborated for many years and whose work I admire a lot. So there's a lot of work of this kind, but I find this a sense of division between our work and the policy-making world is too great. So I want to bring these things together and to talk about, to use a kind of language that connects us back to that realm rather than create division. So, and this fundamentally brings us to the question of what kind of political community. I mean, this is a philosophical question at the heart, really, of what I'm going to be talking about, and I won't be able to deal with it a great deal, although I will elaborate it later. What kind of political community do experts and intellectuals belong to? I'd like us all to ask ourselves that question. I think it can be a provocative question. I don't mean it provocatively, I mean it constructively. The persistent problem for university-based experts in relation to policy or to critiquing the public decision-making, which I've been a bureaucrat, and I've heard academics talk about the bureaucracy as though it was this enemy other, and even publicly criticized me once specifically in that way at a meeting in Vancouver, it was. I think it's really a big shame if academic scholars imagine themselves to be living in a space that doesn't need to justify itself to, or that evidence relieves us of the need to be accountable to. So what kind of political community do we, the experts, belong to? And I think we should use the word expert, because why should ordinary people working in environments trust us if we can't provide something that's the fruit of systematic research and investigation? It's got to be a value-added contribution that we make. So what is the value of what we contribute? I think it's important to continually interrogate ourselves in that way. When we interact with other stakeholders, and already the word stakeholder is very fraught in this context, but nevertheless, what 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 claim do we make that people should listen to us more than perhaps just an ordinary opinion? I think I can defend that claim. I think we all can, but I think we should ask ourselves that regularly. So in political theoretical terms, these questions are fraught, especially in relation to language policy, because many people make a claim on language policy. When you're outside of the policy process, it's not obvious. But when you're inside it, you realize that there's lobbying from multiple groups with very contradictory interests often. And the process of sewing those things together, especially if it aims to be a comprehensive policy, is very complex. And I hope to write something more about that in the next couple of years. So my question then is that what is the moral purpose of our advocacy, of our research, and what is its political purpose as well? And a large part of this question has to do with the fraught issue of language problems. What is a language problem? I won't be able to talk about this much, but I just want to say that I've admired the work of Hans Duer from the Central Institute of Indian Languages. No one uses language problems much anymore, even in language planning theory. But Duer at the time came up with this typology of what are language problems according to who defines them: insiders, outsiders, politicians, bureaucrats. And I think he put his finger on some very important questions, which has been a part of what I've developed in my recent work, to think about who is it that's defining a language problem? Because we have to keep in mind that policy is a response to a problem. All policy is a solution to generate public resources to tackle a problem. If we say that language problems are just a way of oppressively thinking about society, we won't be able to enter into negotiations or discussions with policy officials. I don't mean we should fall into negative naming. Obviously, we should never do that, but we have to be aware that the base problem basis is clearly at the center of policy making processes. Now I'm going to move to the question of policy, peace building. And I want to just very quickly, I'm going to go through a long history of thinking about this, what counts as peace building, and that term already is one I'll have to explain in a moment, has a long history of thinking. There are multiple ways to think about how states should think about peace building, and our world is conflicted in a very deep way today, with horrendous wars going on in multiple places, some of these conflicts getting major attention and others not. And already there's a lot to explain about all that. But I think the authoritative or dominant way in which Western societies think about, or the dominant sections of Western societies think about peace or a world without overt conflict, comes from, not maybe directly, but from the work of Immanuel Kant's idea that liberal republics engaging in free commerce provide the conditions for lasting world peace and bring an end to war between states. And this is thinking, of course, of wars between states, that is, sovereign territories, bounded nations fighting each other for territory or whatever other thing they contest. And this kind of thinking has flowed into US policy through its post-World War I, and then very importantly into the creation of the United Nations after the Second World War. And that has dominated the way, I mean, not necessarily explicitly tracing it to Kant's perpetual peace in the end of the 18th century, but definitely the same ideas that are there, that liberal republics and commerce were critical to this. We see this quite recently in works on basically theorization of capitalism and free access to capital and the logic and subjectivity of capitalism in Friedman's Flat World. Now, a lot of people in language areas have never read this book or even come across it, I noticed, but I can guarantee you that huge numbers of people in other discourse domains have read this kind of literature and know this way of thinking. And whether overtly or not, whether they think of Kant or Friedman, these ideas are clearly there in the back of their minds, their ways of thinking about what produces peace. And here, competing but bounded nation states, usually with a dominant ethnicity, a dominant language, a dominant literacy, are the way they imagine a peaceful future. The OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of the most influential policy structuring bodies in the world, at least for rich countries, and this flows through to developing countries. I've worked in quite a few societies that would count as poor or developing, or however they're labeled. They used to be called third world. Fortunately, we don't use that terminology anymore. But in these countries, and I've met and discussed with ministers of education and others, and I've been startled, in fact, I wrote something about this once, how often they use the same language of policy making that comes from these structures that deal with societies that are not their own. And this is because these are the ruling ideas in how people imagine states. Now, the social cohesion logic of the OECD is that it involves these three terms of, and there's a lot to agree with here, even if we might contest the basic premises of it. Social inclusion, this is clearly the case. If you have alienated populations, you have the prospects of conflict. If people don't have social capital to compete effectively in society, it's very clear that as individuals and ultimately as whole groups, they will be left out. And social mobility. And nevertheless, though, these three do speak to a particular worldview, a particular logic that comes from what I've been describing: a liberal capitalist peace, a form of competing individual interests. There could be other ways to think about this. And what tends to have contested this view mostly in thinking about peace work in the world has been the ideas of Johan Galtung, the Norwegian, basically people call him the father or the founder of peace building or peace theory, and his influence is certainly extraordinary, who died only a few months ago. And produced a huge amount of work. But there are only two of his terms that are, well, peace building is the one I use mostly because I find it productive and forward-looking. But the terms negative and positive peace are important in the lexicon of modern peace building theory, and I'm going to mention these a bit later. When we look at our own field, applied language studies or sociolinguistics or linguistics, we tend to see that the way, peace education and peace has been certainly part of the focus of some scholars, not actually that many and not much. There's decades between substantial works in this area. And they're mostly about communication. Most of this work is about the way in which people can speak well or better, less oppressively, etc. And we can see the tradition through performative views of language that have arisen in linguistics, ultimately perhaps tracing back to Wittgenstein, but certainly, or even earlier, there's certainly a tradition that's very powerfully present in linguistics, which is that modes of not just speaking, but communicating in general can be construed or done in ways that are alienating and oppressive, and in ways that are not that and actually contribute. So you can see the subheading here: communicating to create harmony, etc. So these are ways to do it. I'm not wanting to disagree with any of this, but it's not the kind of work that I do. So the general peace building approaches, I've got just focus on the bits in italics there. Negative peace, which Galtung understands as the absence of overt fighting or direct violence, or hot violence, we might call it. And he contributes into the literature the idea of structural or cultural violence, or the cultural violence comes out of other people responding to him later. But he talks about structural violence, that is the perpetuation of inequalities, hierarchies, and forms of oppression, which ultimately produce negative conflict of different kinds, or if they're not addressed, hot violence. And when these are solved, usually through intervention, you can have a form of negative peace. That is, those inequalities remain and persist, and the potential for merging into forms of disruption of social cohesion is always there. So he calls that a negative peace. And then a positive peace means moving from that position to a more integrated and resilient society in which the problems and tensions are not absent, because we can't imagine that to be the case among human beings, I guess, but at least there's a non-violent resolution of conflict when it arises. Now, in the peace-building literature, structural violence holds back positive peace because institutions and social arrangements naturalize inequalities and grievance. In other words, people think, oh, well, inequalities are just there in human nature. And I think that that's one of the problems with the Kantian tradition, that we have this sense that there's and they're just naturalized as inequality and grievance. Now, Jean-Paul Lederach in the United States has taken another position, which he calls just peace, the fused two words like that, in which he's pursuing the absence of all forms of violence of varying temperature. Now, I don't want to go into this too much, but I just wanted to introduce this terminology because I think it's really important, and all of it leaves aside what we're dealing with, and that's what I've been trying to do, is to inject into this literature the interests of minority subnational populations, because the Kantian world peace that's flowed into the way in which the UN works is about states and between states. And what I'm concerned with here is subnational, within states, forms of conflict. And this takes me to the area of work I'm going to be discussing, the area of the world I'm going to be discussing, Southeast Asia. I want to say that whilst I'm talking about this here in this part of the world, because this is where I've worked, it's not only here. I mean, these kinds of subnational conflicts are everywhere. I'm aware that McGill University is, of course, in Quebec, where there's been a long struggle for language laws and grievances around language, which is very similar to some of what I'm describing elsewhere. So these, and of course, Indigenous populations, marginalized and oppressed in many societies, have a lot to say about this, and we should all listen to them. So, but at least in this part of the world, this work, which has been continued and confirmed, of multi-decadal conflicts unresolved within societies. I'm thinking specifically here of Thailand and Myanmar, Myanmar across the whole society, and Thailand in the provinces in the south, in which language questions are very, very prominent. And this is, I mean, I didn't go into these environments to research the phenomenon. I went in to help support projects of language justice, advocacy, and minority rights, but I've become interested in the research framework that could derive from this as a result of that presence. So we can see that some of these are the most enduring, widespread, and deadly form of conflict in Asia. Subnational conflict, as you can see there, enduring over the past 20 years, 26 subnational conflicts in South and Southeast Asia, affecting half of the countries of this region, among the world's longest running armed struggle. I should say that actually within all of this literature, and I can't really discuss it today, there's a whole new focus on what's called new war theory, new forms of conflict that are identity-based and that are starting to grapple with the subnational conflicts that I'm going to be describing, but to think about them in terms of the tradition of peace-building theory, which I think is has run its course and always operated in the interests of states rather than populations. So the prominent subnational conflicts could be the ones in Mindanao in the Philippines, southern Thailand, Aceh and Papua in Indonesia, Assam and Kashmir, and now many others actually in India, northeastern India, northern Sri Lanka, but actually more widely than that, Balochistan, Myanmar, and Burma, the two names for that country. There are over 7 subnational conflicts, 6 of them lasting for more than 40 years. And since the military coup of 2021, the entire nation involved in this struggle. Now, 2 of the recommended readings that I hope people have had a chance to look at are deal with these conflicts, both Thailand and Myanmar, from my perspective. And of course, it's my own and can be dissented from, etc., but it's based on involvement in these places. Handbook of Linguistic Human Rights on Myanmar and the work I've done there, and the Palgrave Handbook of Languages and Conflict on Southern Thailand. My chapters on Southern Thailand. And so these most recent maps, you can see the yellow parts of the map on the right. I assume it's on the right of Thailand. The provinces that are in conflict there, a contestation based in which language is a significant factor, and Myanmar, in which all the red indicates violent events just in the last 3 years involving the response to the military coup of February 2021, which disrupted a short window of democratic opportunity led by Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy party that she led. Now, in all of these, I'm going to move more quickly now. We see that education and language are massively ignored if we look at the literature. I can tell you specifically in relation to Sri Lanka, even though one of the critical events that led to the deterioration of social relations, massively exacerbated by colonial intervention prior to this, of course, which set up part of the conditions of this conflict, was a language law in 1956 that removed Tamil and English from allowing students access to higher education. It was a language law which enshrined one language. And yet, when you look at external writing by scholars, development scholars, lawyers, political scientists, economists, etc., they hardly see language. They don't identify it, and those who do dismiss its contribution. Now, I don't want to say that language is a critical source of this conflict. It both reflects and produces things. I don't believe any conflict is single causal. They're always multi-causal. There are always multiple contributing factors, and they compound each other. I'm not in any way but trying to suggest that there's a language-led issue here. But I do think that ignoring it means that some of the longer-term solutions that would build a more socially just civil settlement that would produce positive peace in Galtung's terms is very unfortunate. It tramples on the rights of minority populations, and it excludes them from participation in the ways they wish to be involved in their solutions, and they often surface questions of language. So in my own conclusion at the bottom there, you can see from looking at through the UNICEF study I did for several years in Southeast Asia, some aspect of language is present in many conflicts. Some kinds of conflict involve many aspects of language, and some conflicts are only about language, or for a period of time are only about language. I think I can defend that claim from the literature and the study that we will see. This Professor Sule Premsrirat, who sadly passed away earlier this year, and here we see a quote from her receiving an award in UNESCO, the King Sejong Literacy Prize in 2016, was an extremely active and brilliant scholar of minority populations, more widely across Southeast Asia, but definitely within Thailand. And she worked in the contested provinces in what's called the deep south of Thailand. And you can see from her quote there that I've drawn from her acceptance speech of this prize, because she devised with her colleagues a series of multilingual education or bilingual education interventions, which sadly have been eroded in recent years. In Patani Malay, the local form of Malay, these provinces have 80% Muslim Malay speaking population within a Thai-speaking Buddhist society. So this Patani Malay Thai bilingual, multilingual education. I like this statement very much because it very simply, clearly gets through one of the ways in which I'm going to say that language and conflict are connected to each other. It's a Muslim community in a mainly Buddhist country, and they speak their own Malay dialect. So already we know it's not the standard form, or it is its own standard, but it's a variety of the Malay language called Patani Malay. It's different from Bahasa Malaysia in Malaysia. Or Indonesian, indeed. The fact that most students don't speak Thai means they've done poorly in the Thai monolingual school system, not always gone on to higher education. They face problems finding work, makes it easier for youth to be drawn into conflict. So what is the connection between language and conflict here? We can see that it is actually what I call this the slow acting effect of language. So poor language policies that ignore the rights of minority populations, a slow acting effect, as I call it. And then there's this fast acting effect is when these populations are subjected to hate speech or exclusionary language. So I see language operating in both the slow and fast way. And I've drawn that from the 2016 work I did in these settings. Now, this language is generally not original language. I'm not going to say much about this, except the parts in red at the bottom, you can see in the middle there, you can see written in English, the words there is a lot to do. You can see that then in Thai, in Malay, and in Jawi or Arabic script. So there's a contest about how to write this language. And then there are 5 languages involved in this setting: Thai, Patani Malay, Bahasa Malaysia, English, and Arabic, and 3 scripts. So this is the kind of environment in which policymaking would respond. And we know that policymakers think about problems of this kind in a particular way. And this is what I'm going to move to now. So I think policymaking is a special kind of talk. Who says what to whom and with what authority do they talk? This is the critical question. I think there are 3 categories of people. This is a slightly simplified way to talk about it. In July, I ran a 6-hour or whole day policy literacy session in Innsbruck for the International Language Testing Association conference, and I'm writing that up next year or early next year as a contribution to thinking about performative language as a form of solution seeking, which kind of links the earlier way to think about peace building within linguistics and peace building as I'm framing it here, that is peace building around the rights of minority populations who are defined by language, or who define themselves at least partly by language. So there are officials, citizens, and experts. Now, all categorizations of groups of people are a little bit artificial because many of us, all of us, occupy multiple categories. But nevertheless, in these discussions, people occupy predictable positions. And you know that by the way they speak. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So in response to the language problems as officials define them, we've set up, and as I say, I call them metalogs, set up a series of dialogues. I believe some people in the audience today might have been present at 1 or 2 of these. I hope that's the case. To produce policy conversations that move beyond the defined problem of officials. Like governments say, the problem is that minorities don't speak the official language, or minorities are not literate, or minority cultures or the minority populations are too poor to have books in their homes. So all of these ways of defining what the problem is that the policy will tackle are defined according to the interests of powerful segments of society. And I have always believed that it was better, rather than starting with those definitions, if it's possible to finance these things or to create them otherwise, to move to what I call at the bottom a voice democracy approach, to redefine problems from the bottom up, to have a new set of language or definitions of how these problems are to be seen. And in Myanmar and in Thailand, but this is just in relation to Myanmar, I'm not going to talk about this much, but went through the process of writing policy that you would describe has come out of the policy sciences. That is formal gathering of evidence, formal identification of a problem, formal procedures for coming up with options, etc. And then we find that that doesn't always work. So we engaged in processes of bottom-up redefining of the problem. I'm just going to show you some images of how these work. We basically meet in these categories of, I know I ran 45 of these in Myanmar, about 8 in Malaysia or 10 in Malaysia, several in Sri Lanka and other places in the Pacific. And basically always with the same purpose of bringing those 3 categories of people together: officials who see themselves and identify in their role as politicians or policymakers or officials, experts and community, and with the purpose of uh, going back to what the core problem is, not fitting minorities into the solution that's already predetermined. Now, to some extent, of course, this is idealistic, but in other ways, it's actually worked extremely well. So I just want to go through this. So what we did in Myanmar, and this is written in very formal Thai, Burmese, and in this particular dialogue that these pictures came from, I have got a whole sequence of these, and if you could read the language, I don't, but if you could, and I've had it very carefully analyzed, you can see that the same screen is shown a really detailed refinement of what is named as the problem. This is a characterization of the problem of language minorities. What is the problem according to the state? What is the problem according to them? What is the problem according to educators? What is the problem according to primary school teachers, etc.? So we go through a kind of continual re-editing of the nature of the problem, and we find that by collectively writing a new statement of what the problem is, we get to a level of mutual understanding, not always, often, but not always, mutual understanding, or at least some consensus that the different perspectives that people bring to it are quite legitimate ones. So this process, through doing this before the overthrow of the civilian regime in 2021 in Myanmar, produced this. This is a summary which I hope people have seen in the recommended reading. 3 states adopted and endorsed multilingual state policies, and this was through their hlutos, that is their state parliamentary representative organizations, Kachin State, Kayin State, and Mon. And in all of these, they recognize both a state-dominant language, the national dominant language, and minority languages. And this was a bottom-up concession by everybody to produce this. So I think that was quite successful. Through 45 of these dialogues, an international conference, which was possibly the most difficult thing I've ever organized in my life, in Mandalay in 2016, 360 people debating issues that have been utterly undebatable for a really long time, since the 1962 coup in that country. Changes to 3 or possibly 4 laws, not as much as the advocates had been seeking, but significantly. New materials and curriculum. A lot of this is led by United Nations organizations, I have to say, international non-government organizations, and local language and culture organizations. Hundreds of trained practitioners, studies and reports, inclusion of sign language rights, the discourse of rights, the adoption of a series of principles, which we named after the Union capital, Naypyidaw, and a national language policy summit, which had the First Lady of the country, 5 agencies of the UN, the Minister for Education, Minister. So really top level. So we went from bottom up to top down forms of process, and then another 4 states in that process signed up to the process. So it's possible through these processes to achieve significant change, and I think that counts as significant, even if it was all overthrown later in the political events that transpired. Now, I think I'm going to have to rush a little bit now. I want to put all of this work in the context of what I think is a new theory of language policy. Remember, I said at the beginning I was going to talk about peace building and language policy as a form of policy making. I think that language policy has and should have an interaction between three forms of authority, three ways in which power, you might say, works: sovereignty, jurisdiction, and influence. Four forms of participation in that power through public text, that is a law or a report or something; public discourse, basically meaning argument; and performative action, how we behave ourselves, how we speak, how powerful interests speak, how if people are interested in a performative way of doing language policy, I recommend you go and see a recent film called Kneecap about the way in which in Northern Ireland hip hop and rap groups have been involved in performative action of language planning, even actually quite self-consciously doing it. It's quite an extraordinary lived dramatic. If you don't like violence, you might not want to see the film, but definitely it is a clear form of performative action around language planning. And then what I've been describing here, that is deliberative process in which academic scholarship, officials, and communities come together and produce new texts that are different from top-down ones. And all of these processes impact on the three areas of traditional language policy focus, that is status planning, looking at the status of different languages like French and English in Quebec, and what about the status of other languages there, etc. That's what status planning looks to. Corpus planning, which is what the work that linguists do, mainly looking in collaboration with communities, looking at or the hip hop group in relation to Northern Ireland, as I've just said, looking at the internal body of words and forms of writing in a language. Acquisition planning, teaching and learning, and literacy. And then three that I think really are not included often enough as goals of language planning. That's what G6 means, 6 goals. So 3 forms of power, 4 forms of participation, and 6 goals. Prestige planning, that is the status of these languages, not in terms of the official legal presence, but their prestige in community, and different kinds of prestige, different kinds of value. Discourse planning, how we talk about things and ideology in language, and the domain where languages are used and allowed to be used. Look, I'm actually going to go through this very quickly. I just want to say that these 3 forms of power, jurisdiction, and sovereignty, come from the work originally of Heinz Kloss, working on the US, and I've extended it to some work that I did with others in relation to China and the constitution there. Sovereignty, which is differential, and Canada is a case in point of this, with multiple overlapping kinds of sovereignty and jurisdiction in native Canadian areas, as well as the main provinces, and the differences between the provinces, the bilingual ones, the French official ones, and the English official ones. Influence, which can be official influence, like the creation of forms of representation of your country, the way Japan promotes Japanese through the Japan Foundation, but also undermining kinds of influence, transgressive influence, because power comes in multiple ways. And then the 4 modes of participation and the 6 goals. Okay, so I see this as a model of analysis of language policy and planning, but also, as you've seen from the bottom-up work of the facilitated dialogues, I also think it reconciles academic scholarship and ways to be involved in concrete language policy making. And it was pointed out to me by my colleague Fatih Hilal from Tunisia, who I believe might even be online today, and with whom I've recently finished a book, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, that actually this was validated. I hadn't seen this article by Fitzsimmons Dolan, looked at the basis of this and around a corpus of language policy texts in the United States, and found a high degree of validity in the model, which was very pleasing to see. So I'm just going to finish now with a view of all of this as a new kind of language policy. The for community language rights, the history of policy literacy is influenced by the history of peace building theory that I mentioned as well, but also the interests of the state. In the post-war period, post-World War II period, particularly in New York and under the influence of Harold Lasswell, came this idea that if it were possible to make policy sciences and evidence-based, objective policy analysis and policy writing a science, a technical process above reproach through this process of goal clarification, trend description, these things I've got underneath there, his preview of the policy sciences, that you would have a kind of scientific government. In other words, this would be a kind of government that would be ruled by experts. And I have a lot of problems with this way to think about it, but it's a really important thing to think that policymakers, when you interact with a policymaker, they're probably trained in a system in which in the background, these assumptions are very clear, that it's possible for policymaking to be a relatively objective science. And obviously, there's some truth in this and also some falseness. But just how much evidence is there in real policy? I think that's highly questionable. We don't have to be cynical completely about our government and say that all policy is a cynical exercise of horse trading and political interests and ideologies. But there is quite a lot of that too. When we look at it systematically, it's very clear that policy making generally does not look like this. It's not generally this sequence of ordered passages of decision making, gathering of evidence, working out what the options are from this evidence, and then adopting the most efficient one, doing a cost-benefit analysis and implementing it. Politics is a really deep part of the process, and that policy science tends to undermine it. Through the critiques of this policy science process, there's been, as you can see in the text at the very bottom, Gian Domenico Maione's Evidence, Argument and Persuasion, from within the policy analysis field itself, a strong push to say, look, actually, argument and persuasion are really just as important in what gets made as policy as any technical process. And that's an opening for us as linguists, as academics, to say, if we can participate in the wicked problems of language policy making, we can possibly influence it more effectively. Now, I think I've got a few more slides and I've probably taken close to my time already. You can look at this later, but I looked comparing what a policy scientist would say about multilingualism in the United States compared to what a community group would say about it. And one of the most eminent US policy analysts, Aaron Wildavsky, looks at the conflict, as he called it, of bilingualism, the running sore of bilingualism. Now, which one in our field would use terminology like that? None of us would. But he called it a running sore of bilingualism. And in 1992, for the first time, the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, one of the most, like the Journal of Applied Linguistics that most of us in this audience would read as a go-to for literature in our area, he refers to the finding of universalistic solutions to particularistic problems, bilingualism resolved through a second language requirement for elementary schools. So basically, he sees that the demands for Native American language rights and Spanish rights and community language rights or heritage language rights in the United States can be solved by everybody doing a common second prestige elite language. So a radically different sense of what the problem is. And I think this is very instructive of the way in which this process of making policy is so detrimental to the interests we would want to advance. So it's not good enough just to critique this. I think we have to participate in actively showing a different way to do policy. And that's a way to engage with the process, the way I've offered you one. There can be others, of course, which goes to what is being seen to be the core problem and to redefining that problem. I'm actually going to skip this. I'm just going to say that I've looked at this in terms of the knowledge that's produced by the different interests, the experts, the officials, and the community. And I think if we approach the process of policy making by seeing policy officials as people with knowledge who produce knowledge in a different way from how experts do, and community who produce knowledge and have knowledge in a different way, we could have a more democratic, facilitative, and productive outcome to this process. I'm sorry, I've probably put too much into this talk. I just want to finish quickly by saying, when we look at Southeast Asia or Asia in general, this book written a few years ago called Fighting Words, Language Policy and Ethnic Relations in Asia, Michael Brown and Sumit Ganguly, they looked at policies and language policies in Asia and looked at their impact on social cohesion. And they found that they categorized them as assimilationist policies, and they decided that these are often a threat to minoritized or non-dominant groups, their very existence and flourishing, and accommodationist policies, the ones that tried to respond to minority needs and demands, but found that often these were perceived by elites, as we could predict, as weakening national unity, and they contested them, and this led to conflict too. So criticism of some kinds of policies that appear to actually respond to minority interests is actually justified, because sometimes these aggravate problems for minority populations. With Fatih Helal, lead author in this book on language politics in Tunisia, we've looked in detail as a premise to building a new kind of policy approach in that country, a study of language ideological debates. In other words, how are different groups of people coming at this problem of language within society? And very quickly, and I can't talk about it at much length, what we call the Tunisian linguistic order. You can see that basically there are, if we look at these inner categories here, the defense of the vernacular, the pragmatists who want to promote English and global commerce, the defense of the vernacular, the non-standard forms of both Arabic and French, Arabists and people who promote Arabic exclusively or dominantly or in other kinds of ways, and people who want to defend French and the place of French in the society. If you begin with a premise like this, I think we have a good basis, as I hope that Fatih and I will now go to the next step of seeking to create the kinds of dialogues that I was describing that were done in Southeast Asia around building alternatives. If we go through these kinds of processes, we can go back to the core focus of my talk, which is combining language policy and peace building around with express moral and political purpose of advancing linguistic rights. And this is something that's written collectively by the three interests. Now, you probably can't tell that, but these hands represent different interests. They're the hands of the community, the officials, and experts that come together to jointly write from the definition of what is the problem and who's going to define what it is. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
All right, so I jump in. So thank you very much, Professor Bianco, for your great talk and for your insights on language rights and peace building